is sort of a personal story, but I didn't do it intending it to be that way. Whenever the first Iraqi war started, I read an article about problems, how difficult it was for the families of the soldiers to survive. They missed the people. There were perhaps financial problems. There was a lot of extra responsibility for the wife or the husband left behind, taking care of children and so on and so forth. And I thought, no, people don't recognize that. They don't remember that. And I just wanted to tell a story that had something to do with that. So then I thought of this incident and turned it into a story. So I call this story The Letters. When you walked into the small living room and then past that into the dining area, on the back wall, it was all taken up with a map of the world as it was in 1944. And on that map, there were a series of thumbtacks. Started up in upstate New York, went down the East Coast to New York City and Norfolk and Charleston, South Carolina, and then over to Chicago, and then down in Seattle and San Francisco on the West Coast, and one thumbtack way out in Hawaii. Now, those thumbtacks were tracing Pat's places as he served in the Navy in 1944. Pat had been drafted the year before at the age of 35, which at that time was considered quite ancient to be drafted. But the war had been on for a long time, and everybody who could was going. And everyone who was drafted would have been probably overlooked if it had ended earlier. But Pat was married to Mary, and they had 4 children. And Mary was living in that house with the map with the 4 little kids. And every day they would look at that map and trace the thumbtacks and talk about all the places that Daddy had been on his little ship in the Navy as part of the U.S. Naval Fleet. They knew that he was out in the Pacific at this point, but never knew quite where. This was a very tough time for Mary. There weren't any automatic washing machines or interesting kinds of appliances to make life easier then. She also had almost no money, trying to live on whatever the allotment was the Navy sent her. She had a huge garden to take care of and all sorts of hard work to do. But she was only about 32, and she was tough, and she was convinced she could do this. Having also 4 children from age 7 down was not easy at that time. The thing that kept Mary going, however, were Pat's letters. Now, Pat was a great big kind of gruff guy, but he could write a letter that just made you feel good. But this was not email like we're used to today. This was V-mail. They wrote the letters, the letters came on sort of tissuey paper. It was just one sheet, but it folded over and made its own envelope. And you only really had the space of 1 page to write. And then sometimes that was all blacked out. If the censors read it and thought there was anything there that would give damaging information to the enemy, they blacked it out. So you might get a letter that just said, "Dear Mary," and "How are you?" And down at the bottom, as long as it had this, she didn't care if it was blacked out. "I miss you. Give the kids a hug for me. I love you, Pat." If that was there, she got through that day and waited the next day. Now, every day, she tried not to be too obvious about this, but it seemed like around the time the mailman was going to come, Mary made sure she was in the front room or near the front door so she could peek up the street to see if Joe the mailman was on his way, because she was needing those letters to keep going. And if Joe didn't have a letter, she'd be out on the porch saying, "Joe, are you sure you don't have a letter for me down in that big bag of yours?" He'd say, "No, Mary." Pat's out there saving the world for us. We can't expect him to have time to write every single day. You'll get more letters tomorrow, I bet you, or the next day. Sometimes these letters get held up, you know. So she'd go in and she'd reread some of the old letters and get through another couple of tough days. And then, all of a sudden, there was a time when there were 4 days with no letters. And by the 5th day, she was not just looking out the window, she was out sweeping off that front porch 6 or 7 times, waiting for Joe to come around the corner. Sometimes, in the past, when he was coming around the corner, if he saw her out and had a letter for her, he'd reach in his bag and wave the letter as he walked down the street, but that wasn't happening now. So a week went by, and 2 weeks, 3 weeks. Joe didn't even want to walk down that street. It hurt him to see how sad she looked. 4 weeks, 5 weeks and no letter. Even those little kids knew something was wrong, and they were kind of quiet, as kids can sense when they better be quiet because their mother had other things on her mind. So by almost the 6th week, Mary was exhausted. And this one night, after days and weeks of going through with what if this and what if that, and what if this has happened, and I wonder if he's hurt, and I wonder if he's in one of those prison camps, and I wonder if his ship got hit and if he's hurt, and so on. She finally figured out that she had to get some rest. So once the children got to sleep, she went to bed and somehow put all those what-ifs out of her head, and she fell into a sound sleep. And then all of a sudden there was a pounding on the door. She could hear it downstairs, and she jumped up and put her robe on, and she went into the children's rooms to see if they were sleeping, and they were. So she went to the top of the stairs, and the pounding stopped. Oh, I must have been dreaming. I must have been having a nightmare or something. And she started back to the room, and it started up again, pounding and knocking and pounding. And she started down the stairs, and it stopped for a second, and she stopped, and then it started again, and she continued that long walk down the stairs. By the time she got to the last step, she thought she could hear a voice out there calling to her, saying something, but she couldn't tell what it was, and she finally reached for the doorknob and pulled open the door, and there was Joe, the mailman. And he said, Mary, we just got a bunch of letters from way back. They were held up from the invasion of the Philippines. Here's 6 letters from Pat, and I think there'll probably be more tomorrow. And she said, thank you, Joe. And she took those letters, and she couldn't move any further than the steps. And she sat there, and for the rest of the night, she read and reread those letters. Well, Pat got home safe and sound. His ship had been part of the U.S. Naval Fleet at the invasion of the Philippines. That was the time when MacArthur returned, if you remember your history. And he came home safe and sound after the war ended. He didn't talk a lot about his war experiences, but every once in a while he would say something that related to that particular time period. And Mary, who usually didn't butt in, when he got to that part, she would always stop him and say, Pat, there were a lot of heroes where you were, but right here, my hero was Joe, the mailman. And I know that story well because I was one of those little kids up in the bedroom sleeping when all this happened, and I heard about it over and over again. And that's the letter story.